Thank you all for joining us today to our inaugural event in the Belt and Road and Global Perspective series at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. The Belt and Road and Global Perspective project is a new project that brings together people from across academic disciplines to discuss the downstream consequences as we see them emerging of this massive transformation that is being unleashed across Eurasia and Asia and beyond as well, that comes about because of the Belt and Road Initiative. The project is supported by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and we thank them as well as the Munk School for their ongoing support. There is no better person to start our conversation about some of the downstream consequences of the Belt and Road Initiative than our guest today, Jonathan Hillman, who is, as you will know, a senior fellow with the CSIS Economics Program and director of the Reconnecting Asia Project, which is, I think, Jonathan and I were speaking before, I think that's where I came to know his work just a little bit. So I suggest having a look at the Reconnecting Asia Project, which is one of the most extensive open source databases tracking China's Belt and Road Initiative around the globe. And there are lots of them now. Hillman has become quite visible on this issue, testifying before Congress, briefing government officials, and so on, as well as publishing in a number of quite visible national and international outlets, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and so on. He has a book which I highly recommend. It's very, very topical. It's very smart. It's also extremely well written and accessible. It's called The Emperor's New Road, China and the Project of the Century. This is Yale University Press, 2020. And it's the basis for his talk today. We're really delighted to have you here, Jonathan. Love to hear what you have to say about the project, which will be a bit of a summary of the book, but perhaps with an opportunity to ask you questions at the end. Jonathan will hold forth for 25, 30 minutes, somewhere in there, and then we'll have a question and answer, which I will moderate. There is a Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. With any luck, your interface may be different than mine. And there you can pose any kind of question that you have for our speaker. And we will have a look at those and provide him an opportunity to respond. Jonathan, thanks for being with us today, and welcome, I guess, virtually to Toronto.
Thanks for having me, Ed, and really congratulations on launching this new project. I'm really interested to follow your work, and I think this focus on downstream consequences is really fascinating, and really is going to fill a really important gap in the lots of no shortage of prognosticating about Belt and Road, but I think actually the amount of really empirically informed work and stuff that's bringing together different disciplines in particular, there just isn't enough of that. And I think what we can say too is with something that has had a real focus on connectivity, if we know one thing about the Belt and Road, it's that the consequences in some places will be very unexpected. So I think throughout history, connectivity projects have had unintended consequences, whether they be on financial systems or on migration, movements of people, or in some cases the spread of diseases. And because connectivity doesn't just carry good things, it carries lots of other things. And so I really, I'm very interested in following this project, and it aligns. I think maybe some of the philosophy here aligns with some of the work that we've been trying to do at the Center for Strategic and International Studies over the last few years. The Reconnecting Asia Project was founded in order to really provide a sort of ground reality check of infrastructure projects across the supercontinent of Eurasia, China's Belt and Road being one of the most active efforts, but not the only effort. And that's sort of the core of what I've tried to do with this book. The book draws from visits to about 16 countries. And, I always I learned so much from actually going and seeing these projects and seeing what's there, or in some cases isn't there. And so I'm kind of nostalgic now, not being able to travel, but in doing the book was able to do, crossing the Russia-China border on a ferry, crossing the Caspian on a ship, taking rail connections in East Africa, and learning just a lot in doing that, and looking at the history too of some of these places. That's also a real big focus of this book. I've tried to I've tried to put into context the fact that China is, of course, not the first rising power to be doing big projects beyond its borders. And so I try to use some comparisons to trying to use history almost as a yardstick to help show in what ways is what China doing similar to the rising powers that preceded it, and in what ways is what China is doing different. And I'm definitely, I was struck in doing this, both the field work and that some historical research, in many of the ways in which China is really repeating the mistakes of some of the of its great power predecessors. Whether that's the United States and Pakistan, or following closely in the footsteps of Japan in Southeast Asia, or some European powers in East Africa. And so, yes, of course, what China is doing has its own characteristics, and in many ways, I'm struck by, I think, some of the barriers China faces to really getting these projects done overseas. It's never been easy, but I think it's even more difficult now. So again, really important to look at how this is unfolding in its local context. And so, I'm gonna share some broad observations about the Belt and Road today, but I do that with a great deal of modesty because, again, this really does depend on the local context. This is also something that's not static too, and I'll talk about that a little bit, how it's changed. So let me share my screen here. I've got a few slides to help walk us through. Okay, so hopefully that's coming through. I've got three parts to what I'm hoping to do today. The first is to just remind us what the Belt and Road was when it was announced, and some of the grand promises and rhetoric around its announcement in 2013. Then to do a quick reality check, to just point out how on the ground in several places, the activities that have actually gone ahead have really only been a fraction of what's been promised, and plenty of challenges have been encountered. Of course, things are also happening on the ground. I don't mean to argue that this is that nothing is changing, but again, I'm struck by the obstacles that China is confronting as it rolls out what's been called the project of the century. And then finally, I like to look ahead and just flag a few trends that I think are going to be very important as we watch the Belt and Road going forward. So just to get us started here, this is a map that might look familiar to people who have been following the Belt and Road. It's based off of a map that a Chinese state media outlet unveiled, I think, in 2014 or 2015. And on the one hand, this map really exaggerates what the Belt and Road is, and in another respect, it actually underplays what the Belt and Road is. So it exaggerates what the Belt and Road is because some of the corridors that you see on this map and other Belt and Road maps are still relatively aspirational. It's one thing to draw a corridor across the supercontinent of Eurasia or around its maritime periphery or beyond. It's a whole nother thing to actually make that happen, to encourage economic activity where maybe it's been relatively limited, and to help coordinate all of the countries through which something like a Silk Road economic belt is intended to run. And so I think there's been an assumption sometimes that these are already active or being developed. I think they these corridors also have served as a convenient framing device for Chinese officials to say, look, this is organized, it has this logic to it. But again, these corridors are very nascent. And I think when we see maps like this and you see people talking about corridors, I think we need to ask questions like, okay, well, what cities does the corridor go through? What specific pieces of infrastructure are part of it? Have the countries through which this passes actually adopted this in any way in their development strategies? Did they propose this, or is this something that is being kind of thrust upon them? Are they coordinating with each other, or is this being done, only bilaterally between China and the various recipients? And so that's one way in which these maps, I think, are somewhat misleading, sort of exaggerate what this is. But on the other hand, I think we can say that a map like this also understates what the Belt and Road is. And by that, I mean that the Belt and Road has expanded well beyond this map and probably any single map, beyond the scope that could be captured by any single map. It now includes an Arctic dimension. It includes, plenty of activity in Africa, Latin America, cyberspace, and even outer space. And so, the part of the Belt and Road that I've focused the most on is infrastructure. Infrastructure is, I think, often the carrot for countries to participate in the Belt and Road. It's also the source of some of the West's, greatest anxiety about these projects, because many of them, by nature, are dual use. But infrastructure, is not the only. From day one, it's never been the only part of the Belt and Road. The Belt and Road has also included people-to-people ties and policy coordination across a whole host of areas. And that set of policy issues has expanded, and the set of activities that have been accommodated under the Belt and Road banner have expanded since it was announced in 2013. There still is no official criteria for what qualifies as a Belt and Road project. And because of that, I think that gave this some really strong political momentum coming out of the gates, allowed different interest groups to repackage, their work as being supportive of the Belt and Road, but also has created a real management challenge for Chinese officials. If you can't measure something, it's very difficult to manage it. And so there are still lots of definitional questions about what's included, what's not included. Just to give us a little bit of context, just in historical terms and financial terms, there are various numbers that are floated for what the Belt and Road is in terms of its financial scope. This again, is challenging because there's no official criteria for what qualifies as a project. But the number that we hear the most often is $1 trillion in promised investment for infrastructure. And in fact, if we look at the best data that I've seen, which is actually collected by AEI, suggests that there's been about $460 billion of construction contracts signed between China and countries participating in the Belt and Road between 2013 and earlier this year. So let's be generous and say roughly half of that $1 trillion has manifested itself in construction contracts that have been signed. But I think we need to dig a little bit deeper into that, because as I'll show you in just a minute, for every deal that is announced, that's not a guarantee that the deal will move forward, or that the project, in fact, will actually become real. And so only a fraction of that 460 figure is actually moving along in terms of projects underway or projects delivered. But in financial terms, that $1 trillion promise is still striking. It's very large. Thinking about the Marshall Plan, which a lot of U.S. foreign policy experts think about as a potential yardstick here. The Marshall Plan, if it were adjusted for inflation, would be about a seventh of the size of the Belt and Road. But there are some pretty important differences between these two things, and I think that they help us help reveal what is different about the Belt and Road. So the Marshall Plan, it was very focused on a specific geography. As I'll show in a minute, the Belt and Roads geography has expanded and expanded. The Marshall Plan was also very focused on a specific time period. The Belt and Road was, announced in 2013, but it's open-ended, and projects that often predate that 2013 announcement are often counted. So that it's much more flexible and amorphous in that respect. Perhaps the most important difference, though, is that the Marshall Plan was focused on rebuilding primarily Western Europe, rebuilding advanced economies. And China's Belt and Road Initiative has been focused primarily on developing economies, not exclusively, but primarily, and that presents just a much higher degree of difficulty. This is a map that shows just captures some of the participation in the Belt and Road Initiative. The countries in darker blue are those that have signed MOUs, and this was updated a couple weeks ago. And so the countries that are lighter blue have signed cooperation agreements. The MOU is held up sometimes as being the sort of deepest form of cooperation participation in the Belt and Road. But even the MOU, I think we should point out, is a relatively weak document. Not all of them have been made public, so I can't say that with certainty, but the ones that have been made public suggest that there's a lot of boilerplate language that's used, a lot of aspirational language about, promoting the Silk Road spirit, for example. And so we shouldn't equate these documents with something like a trade agreement, which is going to be, going to require a much higher degree of coordination, negotiation, and might also have some sort of enforcement associated with it. And because these are relatively weak documents, there's really, no guarantee that signing one of them will even bring you economic benefits if you're a country participating in a country signing an MOU. And so there's been a very wide range of experiences. So everything from, a country like Italy, which, literally rolled out the red carpet for Chinese officials last year, signed an MOU. This was, a real success for Chinese diplomats because Italy, was the largest economy to sign on to date, member of the G7. Then Chinese officials continued on to France, which did not sign an MOU, but did about 16 times the amount of deals. And so this is, again, the MOU is not a guarantee of benefits. It's also not a precondition for doing business with China. Very different experiences. And I think at this point, with so many countries now on this map, we see 138 signing MOUs or cooperation agreements. What does it mean anymore to sign one of these? I think we could say it means less than it would have in the very early days of the Belt and Road when the group of participants was smaller. But as the list of participants has grown, and something that I'll discuss in just a few minutes is the amount of resources being made available to them is shrinking. I think that also sets China up for disappointment. Just to have that dynamic of participants expanding, but resources available to them declining. Another source of disappointment for some countries has been the degree to which Chinese companies have dominated the contracts that have been put out under the Belt and Road banner. So this is a comparison that we did with data we collected on contracting about 2 or so years ago. And so the group of multilateral bank projects are projects that have been done by the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank. So those are projects that are put up for competitive bidding. They're very transparent, almost to a fault. Your problem with studying those projects is you're going to find too much documentation when you go to the website to learn about the projects. And then the group of China-funded projects are primarily China Development Bank, China Exim Bank projects. And you see this, this notable disparity between those two groups of projects. And these are primarily energy and transportation projects. So Chinese companies are getting about 90% of the contracts for projects that China is funding. I don't find that all that surprising. The Belt and Road Initiative has been announced by China, paid for by China. Why wouldn't we expect Chinese companies to be among the primary beneficiaries? But it does come into conflict with some of the rhetoric that Chinese officials use to describe the Belt and Road as win-win, and promises of sharing the benefits with participating countries, and promises that some of the that officials in participating countries make to their citizens about, this is going to help us create local jobs, we'll use local workers, and so on. So I think this just is again, not surprising when China has, I think 7 of the world's 10 largest construction companies, and they're still getting about 30% of the multilateral development bank projects, which I think underscores how competitive those Chinese construction companies are, and many of the advantages that they have enjoyed as being state-owned enterprises. But this is something that has been a challenge for countries that are attracted to participating, who want to develop, but want to do that in a way that allows them to hire more of their own local workers, local companies. So I'm going to just very briefly, I'm going to try to get through this part relatively efficiently, but I want to just show 3 snapshots of regions where the Belt and Road has been relatively active, just to, again, point out the disparity between some of the expectations and promises and actually what's been happening on the ground. So the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is often held up as being the flagship corridor of the Belt and Road. That's how Chinese officials have described it. So I think it's fair. It's fair to make that, to use that label. And I think part of the debate around CPEC, as it's called, is about sort of what's the actual baseline that we're talking about here. And depending on what baseline you pick, you might find that you're either more or less disappointed in the results. At one point, the reporting around CPEC from Pakistani newspapers was suggesting that there were close to $100 billion worth of projects that had been announced, and that was, I think, had swelled beyond really any reasonable estimate. But for quite a while, there were estimates in the low 60s, 62 billion, often cited. And we see, somewhere between 20 and 25 or so of what's been announced has actually been delivered. That's still a relatively, significant amount of projects to actually become real. But, it's still, again, only a fraction of what's been announced. So I think, again, pick your baseline. But for me, to deliver sort of a third of what you've promised, I think is more indicative of the challenges that are being faced than a really successful program. And you can see this as well in the special economic zones that have been announced. Really only one of them in Gwadar has been completed, and Gwadar Port still faces many challenges. It has not become the new Dubai that its promoters promised. And then plenty of special economic zones have been announced, but very little has happened with those. Another region where China has been relatively active with Belt and Road related activities is the Western Balkans. This is some data that we collected, and we've got two briefs, with greater detail, just about what China, which activities are underway, and as well as a standalone brief on Serbia, which is really a country that has been kind of the locus of Chinese economic activity in the Western Balkans. But again, what really comes through here is we have lots being announced, really only a handful of things being completed, and just as much that's stalled as completed. And I would guess that in that group of yellow boxes, there are probably more projects that are stalled than have been reported. Last region I just want to pause on for just a moment is Southeast Asia, because it reminds us that China is not the only country pursuing large projects. And in fact, in Southeast Asia, where Japan is arguably the incumbent, Japan has been outspending China in the region, and there are some important larger economies where they've been neck and neck, like Indonesia and Thailand. But this is a story that I think gets less coverage in the U.S. certainly U.S. reporting about China's Belt and Road. But again, important to not analyze this in a vacuum. There are other actors, and in some cases, China is not the most active among them. There has been, I'm going to transition here from sort of what we've been seeing to what to expect going forward. And I think it's very important to point out that, depending on what metric you use, you get different specifics here of project activity. Again, this part of this goes back to the lack of a criteria for what counts as a project. But what we see, in relatively broad indicators of Belt and Road related activity is a drop off in activity that really has been going on even before the pandemic. So, the peak Belt and Road years were probably 2016, 2017. And then we've seen a bit of a pullback. And I think that there are factors, both, internal to China and as well as external factors, among the recipient countries that have combined to help explain that pullback. So, the factors within China, I think there probably is a higher degree of appreciation for the difficulty in delivering these projects. There's also, the lack of transparency around these projects. China's preference to do things behind closed doors bilaterally helps get projects started, but it also pushes a lot of risk into the project planning process. So, rather than opening a project up to public scrutiny earlier, it'll push environmental and social risks deeper into the project process, and sometimes that can come back to haunt project planners. But I think that there's probably a higher awareness of those challenges now. In the early days of Belt and Road, I think some Chinese officials were expecting to take a playbook that had worked for them domestically, although we could argue about how well domestically, and to apply it beyond their borders, and without necessarily taking into account all of the challenges that they would face. There also been, I think this is an area that it's fascinating and ripe for further research. There's been a lack of oversight by Chinese officials over Belt and Road related projects. On the ground, often the most influential actors have been China's state-owned enterprises. And even though they're state-owned, they do have their own set of incentives. They have more technical expertise than the Chinese officials that are nominally supposed to be supervising them. They have, often more resources, more personnel, sometimes deeper local political connections. And in the case of the largest Chinese state-owned enterprises, the heads of those entities will outrank diplomats, Chinese ambassadors in some of these countries. So we're talking about, a real set of actors that would need you would need an apparatus, to supervise these projects that has the authority to do that. And I'm not sure that that's in place yet. And so there's been, I think, a challenge in overseeing these projects after they've been announced. Some of this too, you could imagine becoming a little bit easier as the project pipeline becomes more narrow. A smaller project pipeline would allow Chinese officials potentially an opportunity to do a bit more quality control, to spend a little bit more time supervising these projects. One final challenge that I think is important to mention. The Belt and Road is Xi Jinping's signature foreign policy vision, and canceling large projects is always difficult. There are rarely good political incentives for canceling projects. It's even more difficult to cancel projects, if you're a Chinese official and this is Xi Jinping's signature foreign policy vision. It's been enshrined in the Chinese Communist Party constitution, and so that makes it just all that more difficult to cut costs. And it's interesting, in June, Chinese officials announced that about 20% of Belt and Road projects had been seriously affected. Those were their words, seriously affected by the pandemic. But at the same time that they made that admission, they were also very quick to point out they were unaware of any large projects that had been canceled. So again, you would think that the pandemic would have provided really the excuse to try to cancel as many of the projects that you were thinking about canceling as you could and blame it on the pandemic. But that's, again, very tough to do for political reasons. So looking ahead here, I want to just mention a few trends that I think are going to be very important to watch. And even despite all of the challenges that China's Belt and Road has faced, and even despite how, in some cases, the Belt and Road brand has become relatively toxic, it has this internal resiliency, and it's both for internal and external reasons. I just was talking about some of the internal reasons. But externally, the fact is that the need for infrastructure far exceeds what any one country, China included, can provide. So developing Asia, for example, needs $26 trillion in infrastructure investment between 2016 and 2030. That's according to the Asian Development Bank. And so even when you have officials who are campaigning against the Belt and Road for public office, they tend to not rule participation out when they get into office. And so this is a photo from the Second Belt and Road Forum. You have in the front row Mohammed Mahathir, Imran Khan, two leaders who campaigned against the Belt and Road, and then not only decided to participate in it, but went to Beijing, went to the Second Belt and Road Forum, took the stage and endorsed it. And I think that this just speaks to a reality about the need for foreign infrastructure, and that need is not going anywhere. So I think China will continue to have opportunities there, and a lot of the countries participating in this are interested in maximizing their options. They'd like to create a competition among outside potential lenders. So it's really rarely in their best interest to rule out participating in this. So a very, I think, important trend to watch going forward, one that I'm doing personally more research on, is this idea of a digital second wave of projects. I mentioned that the total amount of project activity is declining. We might, though, be looking at a sort of higher tech Belt and Road 2.0. And that's because as Chinese technology companies face more scrutiny in some advanced economies, the Belt and Road remains, I think, a very attractive avenue for them to go double down, to go grow and engage with emerging and developing markets where some of the security concerns are not, as acute. Now, digital infrastructure has been there all along. This is a picture of Xi Jinping visiting the port of Piraeus in Greece. And there's, the port of Piraeus is much more than just the containers that you see in the background. It also has its own network infrastructure. And so when Costco, a Chinese state-owned company, took over the port, it put out a tender for redoing the network infrastructure at the two terminals that Costco runs. And lo and behold, Huawei won the tender. And so they've done a lot of the systems that you can see on the right of this slide. And so digital infrastructure has been part of the Belt and Road package all along. Often fiber optic lines are laid alongside highways or rail projects. It's just cheaper and easier to do it when you're doing those linear infrastructure types. Another key way in which digital infrastructure is being packaged and sold is through smart cities, or what many Chinese companies refer to as safe cities. Safe city emphasizing the surveillance security aspects of these systems. And this is a roundup of the agreements that Huawei had done in different countries as of last fall. And I think what jumps out here is, again, this is, you see a very big emphasis here on developing and emerging markets. Most of them middle income, many of them partly free, heavy representation from Asia and Africa. And so, in some respects, these are the markets of the future where population growth is expected to be significant. And so even as Huawei and other Chinese tech companies are getting squeezed out of advanced economies, the Belt and Road remains very attractive for them in these markets. And then just in conclusion, you know, I'm hoping we could get into some of this in the discussion and Q&A. Here are a few other developments to watch. Underway is, I think, what we might call the Great Renegotiation or the Great Debt Renegotiation. Over 100 countries have approached the IMF for debt relief. For many of them, China is their largest bilateral official creditor. And so I imagine that Chinese officials are spending more time renegotiating deals than they are negotiating new deals right now. And it's challenging for them as well because, you know, not having made this as centralized as some of us had assumed, you know, recipient countries are not dealing with a unified China here. They're dealing with China Development Bank, which has its policy, dealing with China Exim Bank, which has its policy. They're dealing with Chinese state-owned enterprises who have their own interests. So it's a very, it's a somewhat chaotic process right now, not helped by the lack of transparency around China's lending. I do think that there's interest among Chinese officials in trying to multilateralize aspects of the Belt and Road to share financial and reputational risk. Happy to talk more about that. The Health Silk Road is something that has been receiving more attention in the wake of the pandemic, but received, frankly, very little attention before the pandemic. There was a Chinese policy planning document from, I think, 2014, 2015, that had about a paragraph on coordination of health policy along the Belt and Road, which included goals like sharing information to prevent pandemics. And I think that clearly that was not an objective that was achieved. And there hasn't been a corresponding health infrastructure dimension of the Belt and Road, at least, you know, until earlier this year when a lot of aid was packaged and provided to Belt and Road, or countries participating in the Belt and Road, sometimes under the banner of a Health Silk Road. And then finally, there have been several efforts in recent years, last 2 years in particular. I think the United States has begun a shift from just criticizing Chinese projects to trying to compete, provide alternatives. That shift is still underway, still a lot to do there. But it includes things like the formation of a U.S. Development Finance Corporation, having the U.S. Exim Bank operational, and, you know, efforts like the Blue Dot Network, which is a joint effort among the United States, Japan, and Australia to certify projects that they believe meet an agreed upon criteria. So happy to talk more about that. I think that's an interesting shift, and, you know, one that is likely to continue under a new U.S. administration. So let me leave it there. I apologize for having gone on a little bit longer than planned, but very interested in hearing questions and comments. Thank you.
This is where we do thunderous applause, and you can hear everyone at home offering their thunderous applause. Thank you very much for a terrifically clear overview of the book and some of the challenges, and actually you go beyond the book. And one of the things that I appreciate hearing is that, you know, we write these books and we publish it and then it's frozen. But the, of course, situation you're describing is anything but frozen. There are tons and tons of moving parts, and thinking about how things like the pandemic, which just barely entered into your, you know, the discussion in the book, because it takes a while to publish a book, is of course potentially throwing some curveballs into the situation. But even without that, we've got tremendous, got a lot of moving parts, a lot of variation. And so let me actually start off the questions. We have this tradition of going to our students first. So apologies if I don't recognize you necessarily as a student, but we have one student I will not name, but you know who you are. He or she asks, given the lack of progress in the completion of projects in the Balkans, how would you explain, for example, the rhetorical priority I assume that means the BRI, has retained under Alexander Vucic's government in Serbia? So just to start off the question with something specific about the Balkans.
Great, thank you. And so I have to recommend a report, that I was only one of many authors on, but it was a collaboration between the Reconnecting Asia Project at CSIS and our Europe program that Heather Conley leads. And so we've done a full workup of what China's economic activities are in Serbia and some of the political objectives that it has there. I think Serbia has been doing what many other countries have been doing, maybe with a little bit more, maybe in a sort of a sharper way, in trying to maximize its options. So, it's underreported, the EU, and sometimes underappreciated even in Serbia, the EU is providing much more in terms of financial assistance to Serbia than China is. I think in terms of foreign aid, China is maybe number 4 in Serbia. But the fact that many citizens in Serbia would think otherwise, I think speaks to a somewhat successful political campaign, and really predates the pandemic. But I think the pandemic brought it into starker relief. To have Chinese health equipment arrive in Serbia, and to have Serbian officials, including Vučić, say such, just overly, almost comically nice things. Again, this is, I think, a country that's not entering into an alliance with China, but it's maximizing its options. And I think that's a dynamic that we should expect to happen elsewhere. And it's something that I think can be, for if you're the EU or the US, I think, the way to deal with that is to basically try to receive more credit for the things you're already doing, and to maybe do that in a more visible way, and in a way that's more focused on the benefits of what you're doing than the shortcomings of what China's doing.
Yeah, I definitely want to bring in. I'm going to preview a question that I'll plant if someone else doesn't, and that is to sort of begin to think through what the Biden, not a Biden, but what the Biden administration, will do. Any changes we might see going forward. I'm just planting that right now because I want to go back to another student who actually asked a kind of a similar question. Asking, let's see, would it be fair to say that the controversy around BRI projects has more to do with local politics, combined with China seeking bonus diplomacy points rather than debt trap diplomacy? So this person mentions, and I'm not familiar with the example, the Rajapaksa family in Sri Lanka, Orban or Vučić in Eastern Europe, and so on. So is this really, obviously it's a global infrastructure, or largely almost global infrastructure project with major ramifications around the globe, but is the story really a local one?
Yeah, I think the story is a local one, and yeah, I mean, I have a chapter on Sri Lanka in the book, and to me, the projects that were the worst decisions in Sri Lanka don't happen without domestic politics in Sri Lanka. You don't get the port in Hambantota gets the most attention, but not too far from that port is an airport and a cricket stadium. And what all three of those things have in common is they're all named after Mahinda Rajapaksa. They're all financed by China, built by Chinese companies, and now all barely used. And so I think you just the debt trap narrative. I think China deserves to be criticized for not lending at with international standards, for doing it in a very opaque way. And there's definitely been examples of China using lending for influence. But I think the data on this idea of driving debt up to a certain level so that China can take strategic assets, asset seizures have been very rare to date. And so I think the types of influence I worry more about are going to be outcomes that are not so publicly visible. Taking an asset is very visible, and I think would confirm everyone's worst fears about the Belt and Road. So as these debt negotiations are going on, I think that there's definitely avenues for influence, but asset seizures is probably less likely. And yes, I do. The problem with the debt trap narrative is it sort of, I think it in a way implies that recipient countries are almost pawns, but in many cases, they have such agency, and that's ultimately where many of the solutions reside.
Yeah, definitely want to loop back to that. And I mean, you didn't use the word corruption, but maybe at some point we should throw that into the mix here. But let me just turn to a question from, I'm generally not going to mention people's names, but this person mentions his own name, Peter Francopon. You may know, he says, "Hi, Jonathan." He asks, do you see the BRI scrolling back? And if so, this gets to a question of variation, right? How does China do that and where? It may be that it's in pause mode now during the pandemic, but perhaps afterwards we might see some kind of retreat in certain kinds of places. And so he further asks, if it does pause or retreat, how does that open opportunities or leave gaps that are quite hard to fill?
Thanks, Peter. Good to hear you. And I have to recommend, Peter's two books, The Silk Roads and The New Silk Roads, which were both very helpful as I was doing my own work here. I think that there's a pullback that's happening that's been that predates the pandemic. There's this need for infrastructure, again, that just far exceeds any one country's ability to deliver it. So I think room will exist there, and whether, so as long as China has the will and the wallet, I think it'll have opportunities, frankly, but so will other countries. And so I think, it's worth thinking about how can this be made into something that is competitive in the best way, right? Competitive in a way that is driving project quality higher. That's not always easy, because there's also this, the thing that I have yet to figure out is, there are some projects that shouldn't happen, and sort of having the political institutions in place to, prevent those decisions, those bad project selection choices takes a long time. You're really talking about building a country's capacity, building its rule of law. And so, I think that's a very long process. If China pulls back, yes, there's even more room there. And I think what we want is not necessarily, a sort of a major vacuum, but a pulling back of projects that don't deliver the right quality. And again, there's definitely an opportunity there for others to participate and to compete and shape this.
So that leads to a question that's on my mind. I guess I'm interested to know, like, how do you know if a project succeeds, right? Like, and I guess put differently, here we are sitting in various places, but in the West, probably predominantly here in our audience. We may have certain ideas about what constitutes a successful project. Maybe it's providing a public good. Maybe there's some kind of notion of reasonable profit. Maybe there's some notion of adhering to, rule of law, standards of rule of law. Maybe there's something about human rights protections we could get to in a second, right? Whereas in other contexts, and perhaps in Beijing, I don't know what the metric is for evaluating success. Profitability may not even be, it's got to be on the list, but it may not be at the top of the list. So broadly, let me just ask them in the broadest way possible. How do you know if a project has succeeded, and therefore whether we get to Peter's good question about whether it makes sense to retreat from some of them?
Yeah, I mean, a single project could have different success could mean different things for different people involved in a project. So if you're, China's foreign ministry, you might be less concerned with commercial returns. If you're the person who's responsible for that, if that project's part of your portfolio at China Development Bank, you might have stronger commercial concerns. And so, I think this is one of the things that I think is still ripe for exploration is, how do the various bureaucracies bring their different perspectives to this? I think this is something that's playing out now in some of these debt renegotiations. Ultimately, I do think that we have to focus on the recipients because, this is stuff that's happening, on their territory. It's stuff that really impacts them, their projects that they will live with, whether they succeed or fail. And so, I am personally in favor of, thinking more about these in economic terms. I think, to be fair and objective, I think we do need some criteria that can be applied, across countries, across cases. There are, however, different schools of thought for thinking about, how infrastructure projects contribute commercially. And so I think one of the striking differences between what you might call, the Western approach and the Chinese approach here is that the Western approach is very focused on the return from an individual project. And I think sometimes the Chinese approach can be a bit broader in its framing and can think about a project not as a one-off, but as almost a bet on that country in which it exists, and as maybe a portfolio of projects. And so that leads to very different decisions. It could lead, for example, you look at a port that's totally disconnected from the rest of the economy. It doesn't have the supporting infrastructure, the highways, the rail connections, and so on. A Western investor would look at that and say, those are all risks to this port project. I think the Chinese would look at that and say, those are roads and rail projects to build. So there's still differences in these economic criteria. I think also, the Western approach also has put a more concerted effort on mitigating environmental and social risk earlier on. So those are just a few differences that come to mind.
Okay, excellent. I mean, almost on cue. There's a question here, or she says not so much a question, but a comment regarding the reference to potential unintended consequences. Spent time driving on many of the roads in Ethiopia last year. One of the main highways in the north had just been completed by China. She describes how less than 2 years old, it was already heaving and cracking to such an extent that some stretches were virtually impassable. Locals now view China as being synonymous with shoddy workmanship and corruption, generating resentment and so on. And she says China's brand, at least in Ethiopia, has become toxic. So would this be a success in Chinese terms? I mean, there's an opportunity to redo the roads. Presumably somebody can be hired to, for that particular contract to redo the roads. I mean, I'm saying that in a slightly glib way, but so at some point, the very different notions of success or failure in a project, can come to sort of a head.
Yeah, I think this I think underscores the importance of building viable projects. There's a lot of fanfare that comes around every project being announced, and a lot of people don't stick around to see what happens afterwards. And I think ultimately, the impact of a project on its local community is going to depend on whether it's, actually creating value or destroying value. And it sounds like, in this case, that's been a net negative, not only economically, but then there's some political consequence for China. And I think so there's, but still, the company that built it was still paid to build it. And, so for them, success might have just been to build something and then to move on. There's a reputational cost there to them. But, if they're on to the next thing, or if no one else wants to, do the reconstruction, maybe they get a second chance. So it's complicated, but I think ultimately projects that work tend to deliver for the communities around them.
Okay, right. Okay, let me a question that comes from somebody in the audience. It was on my mind because I work on former Soviet Central Asia myself, and so this is something that's quite palpable and important. This person asks, does the centrality of Urumqi in many BRI land corridors have explanatory power. That is to say, is it an important cause of Beijing's repression in Xinjiang province? And that's maybe not exactly your area, but I guess the question is, does that in fact, does the drive to develop, in fact, I mean, sometimes the BRI is described as an extension of the development projects that, were to develop the Western and other parts of China itself. And so is this a, does this repression follow from this very strong push for this seemingly only developmentalist kind of push?
Yeah, so there's this tension, I think, reflected in Western China, and the security state that's been installed there, that I think is maybe revealing of a deeper challenge that China faces as it thinks about connectivity. And so this is something that I talk about in the last chapter of the book. If you think of the Belt and Road at its core as being about connectivity, and then you go to Western China, and the environment there is the antithesis of connectivity. So there's the enormous human cost. There's also just imagine what it's like to try to just run a normal business, where you've got checkpoints everywhere, and you have to do mandatory anti-terrorism training drills during the day. And then you've got these, border checkpoint after border checkpoint, if you're going, to a neighboring country. That to me is not about improving connectivity, but does, in fact, I think it reveals this emphasis on putting control first, favoring control over connectivity. And I don't think you can have it both ways. I think, to sort of have increased connectivity, especially with, other countries, you do have to give up a little bit of control. And so I think that that's a real tension, kind of at the core of the Belt and Road, not only in Western China, but also if you think about, China talking about improving financial linkages, but having all these capital controls, talking about, wanting to share ideas, but having a censorship regime in place. I mean, this is a really fundamental tension.
Okay. Let me group together two questions. I think they're related. They sort of get us into the digital space. One is from a colleague here at U of T. Can you please talk a bit more about the digital Silk Road, including what technologies are likely to dominate and which companies besides Huawei, and what are the likely challenges? And I think this is potentially linked to another question, just inviting you to speak a little bit more about the safe cities. Which cities or countries are adopting it, and what are the main reasons driving this adoption? You see this technology being deployed across the cities of Central Asia, as far as I understood, for free, with all the attendant notions of surveillance and perhaps e-governance, but also surveillance that comes with autocratic context. But the safe cities, I was interested to see that the safe cities program seems to be much broader than autocratic regimes as well. So anyway, thoughts on those two things?
Yeah, so I think the just to before talking about the China specific offering here, I think the sort of the broader pitch for safe cities, which there's no definition for what the broader pitch for smart cities. There's no definition for what a smart city is. It can include many things, but I think that a lot of the common services are very appealing to officials, in local government, and just imagine being the mayor of somewhere and hearing that if you adopt this system, you can improve traffic, you can lower crime, you can improve waste disposal, really basic municipal services. And then to sort of mix in the China offer here, and there's this financing package. And so really, even if you have to take out a loan for it, it's really all going to pay for itself because you're getting all of these benefits. I've looked at a lot of the advertising around from the Chinese companies doing these projects too. And many of them make claims that are sort of border on snake oil salesmanship, right? Where you're saying in city X, and they won't tell you what city, of course, our system improved citizen satisfaction to 98.3%. And you wonder what, like, you worry a little bit about the 1.7% or so that weren't satisfied. But they make these claims, and you can imagine why that would be attractive. And they'll build you a whole, the ones that will do surveillance, they'll build you a almost like a NASA style control center. If you think about mission control, they will build you this very impressive facility with lots of big screens. And there's there's an appeal to that too, because nothing tells people you're in charge like having, all of the trappings of this, advanced technology. The impact of this stuff, though, I think has been varied. And so you have examples in Pakistan, for example, where, hundreds of cameras that were installed turned out not to work. And, some of the claims about crime coming down don't line up with what's publicly accessible about crime statistics. So I think there's room to do some reality checking on the promises of these systems, but it's clear that they're very appealing. Chinese companies are not the only ones selling this equipment. But when they sell it, they're also not just providing the systems. They will also provide the training to use the systems. And that's when you get sometimes from just selling, a piece of hardware, and you cross the line into really selling, methods for policing in some cases. So I think, there's this, at one level, those systems, their popularity just stems from some very basic and almost universal, challenges wanting to have cities operate more effectively. In certain cases, the idea of having, increased data and, surveillance and control is much more appealing to, more authoritarian regimes, but it's not, the appeal of the package is not limited to them.
Okay, and then there was a little bit more on the digital Silk Road. What technologies are likely to dominate? Which companies besides Huawei? We hear a lot about Huawei, but
Sure.
Presumably there are others.
Yeah, so I think some of the things driving the digital Silk Road here are the fact that recipient countries have just less room to borrow too, because of this financial crisis that many of them face, or financial pressure, and the sort of the large transport and energy infrastructure projects that really characterize the Belt and Road's first phase are more expensive. They tend to be more expensive than digital infrastructure projects. Digital infrastructure projects are not cheap. Depends on what we're talking about, but they tend to cost less than those big energy transport projects. I also think the pandemic has underscored the value of connectivity, just the fact that we're able to have this event, right? Not everyone is able to do this. Not everyone has, the bandwidth and access to do this. And so I think the digital divide, the consequences of being on the losing side of that have become more salient. I mentioned that the pressure that Chinese companies are facing in advanced markets. And so the types of projects that I think they're doing. So first of all, there's still plenty of people to connect with 3 and 4G. There's a lot of talk about the 5G race, but relatively modest amounts globally of people with cell phone access over the next 5 years are going to have 5G, true 5G access. So still, little bit less than half of the world still remains offline. And so huge potential market there. So there's the less advanced wireless networks. I mentioned safe cities, which encompasses everything from cameras to remote sensors on trash cans. So that's a really big bucket. I think of it as Internet of Things, and there are companies. Hikvision is one of them. World's largest exporter of cameras, and has sold stuff to customers in the United States, and some of their stuff has been relabeled under other brands, and so they're the massive provider. There's I think cloud computing will be increasingly important, and so in that category, yeah, Huawei does some cloud computing business, but Alibaba is much bigger. Tencent does a bit. And now China Telecom, one of the three big, the biggest of the big three Chinese state-owned telecom firms, is saying that it's going to make cloud computing a major priority. So a company that began with a Huawei affiliation and still I think maybe does technically have a Huawei affiliation in terms of personnel and maybe some of the branding, does subsea cables, which connects. These are the systems through which over 95% of the world's international data travels. So China went from having no capability to do those projects a decade ago to having the world's fourth largest company. And so that company is owned by Hengtong Group, which is a producer, one of the largest producers of fiber optics in China. So that's another, I think, important area. And then finally, there are also some satellite efforts, relatively nascent and definitely far behind their US counterparts, but efforts to provide low Earth orbit constellations of satellites to provide broadband access. That's an area where Chinese state-owned enterprises are investing, and they're filing paperwork at the ITU. And so it's hard to imagine they won't try to do something there as well. So that really is the outer space dimension of the Belt and Road. And I think, the last thing I'll mention on this topic is I think that this does also intensify because you have within China an emphasis now on new infrastructure. So this is a buzz, a new slogan, not new this year, but it's received more attention this year. And so that's, a call for companies to invest more in digital infrastructure domestically. As that happens, you might see similar examples of excess capacity and a need to offload some of that into foreign markets.
Great. There are several more questions, and I'll definitely try to get to them. We have until 4:30, so there should be some time. I did want to ask you though. I mean, as you were talking, I'm just sitting here thinking, are we still on the Belt and Road, or are we somewhere else? We're in outer space, right? I know we're in the Arctic. And I know that in your book, you talk about obviously you talk about concrete projects with a real materiality, right? Real asphalt, even the quality might not be there, but that's being poured, real buildings that are being built, ports that are being constructed, and so on. But there's a point at which you talk about the BRI as a brand, right? And I've read elsewhere it described as a slogan. Maybe it's in Peter's book, I'm not sure. But in any case, at what point, so let me ask the question this way. Does it work as a brand? Is it effective as a soft power brand for China? And how would we know if it's time to retire the brand and maybe, come up with something new? I mean, the outer space stuff just doesn't seem like a belt or a road, so I don't know.
I think that's fair. This is one of the consequences of, again, not having put forward a criteria for what qualifies. And there's been everything under the sun, from things that I think of as being really core Belt and Road activities, like transport and energy projects, which are the two most active infrastructure sectors associated with Belt and Road activity. To there's Chinese doctors writing in, medical journals about how dentistry should be part of the Belt and Road. To most recently, there was an ex-convict who started a casino in Myanmar under the Belt and Road brand. Actually, this is an interesting case because the Chinese embassy there issued a statement saying that this project was not part of the Belt and Road. So I think we're slowly getting, we have one data point out there. We're slowly putting a criteria together. I think there's been the brand has frankly become, in some places, it's become a little bit toxic. I think the interest on the Chinese side in attracting other investors in this effort to share reputational and financial risk is driven in part by that experience, but also it makes that objective difficult too, because I know there are examples of Western financial institutions that had considered participating in this, particularly around lending related to green infrastructure projects, but they face this reputational calculus because the brand is not very strong. I've always thought that the ultimate Belt and Road project would be one that has no Chinese connection at all. I mean, wouldn't that be like the brand had succeeded beyond its wildest dreams because people were just saying it's, borrowing it, not in the case of a casino, but, in a case of something that was more closely linked. So I think, but it's hard to walk away from the brand because, it's so identified with Xi Jinping. It's in the Communist Party constitution. It's still it's getting less attention domestically in China, which I think makes sense. Tough to imagine, U.S. leaders right now talking about wanting to do a big foreign infrastructure push, when there's so many domestic needs. But it's still showing up on the agendas of international meetings and readouts. And so I think it's tough to walk away from this one.
Fair enough. Good points. Okay, let's get back to sort of the hardcore economics type questions. There are two that have come through. One is really about the debt trap. This person asks if countries can't pay for the infrastructure that's been implemented in their country, examples in some African countries, what happens to the ownership and what are the concerns around this? Let me add to that question. At what point is it a problem for China, right? It's not just a problem for the indebted countries that potentially might have their assets seized. It's, this may become a liability potentially for, or certainly there's a risk there for the enterprises involved, I would expect. So that's the first question. And the second economics related question, I guess really going back to maybe the origins of the thing in the first place, but this person asks, to what extent are BRI projects a full employment program for construction state-owned enterprises, at least when China was trying to cool domestic construction after an orgy of overbuilding that made inflation and credit hard to control? So this is that, the impetus initially, the domestic or a version of the domestic overproduction sort of driving this, this sort of making a virtue out of necessity, I guess, in a way.
So on the first question of what happens as these repayment problems arise, I think the best studies of those cases that I've seen suggest that there's often, payments are deferred. The terms are renegotiated around the payment, so deferral is common. Actually, forgiving, writing it off is relatively uncommon. And the specifics will depend on the country and the contract. And so one of the concerning things is that very few of the contracts are public, and I think that that leads to understandably some concerns about what exactly could happen. But again, the asset seizure part of this is relatively rare. But that doesn't mean that there aren't opportunities for influence. And so you could imagine a situation in which a renegotiation is happening. They arrive on, they reach an agreement to defer part of, a payment for a certain period of time. And in doing that, there's a understanding that, this next project that, the recipient government was planning on doing is going to go to, a Chinese company, or there you could think of sort of more politically charged examples of, you will make a statement in support of China's position on X or its response to the pandemic. So you could imagine these less visible trade-offs. You can imagine things around natural resources and access to natural resources. But in those cases, because this doesn't have transparency, it's not being done. In many cases, it's not being done multilaterally. It's being done bilaterally behind closed doors. It's tough. It's tough to know after the fact whether there was anything non-economic or economic but not directly related to the project that was attached to that as a condition. On the excess capacity question, I do think that this has been a significant contributor to Belt and Road activity. China, I mentioned, I think China has 7 of the world's 10 largest construction companies. They've built so much, as the question indicated. They've built so much domestically that in some cases they've run out of things to build, and in some cases have destroyed value in building, useless assets. And they are, as I mentioned, they're often the most influential actors on the ground, and their incentives might not, their decisions might not center around, whether a project is economically viable or strategically important, but just, an opportunity to build something. And so I do think that's a major contributor. And there was a time, sort of early Belt and Road days, there was a time at which I thought, others had suggested that this could be sort of an off-ramp for some of that excess capacity. But I'm not sure we've seen any indication that the excess capacity challenge has actually been reduced domestically. So rather than being an off-ramp, this might have been something that just prolonged, that kicked the can down the road.
Interesting. Do you, somebody asked, do you think there are any downsides for country X to sign an MOU with China on the Belt and Road?
Yeah. So, in the calculus about signing the MOUs, I think, the MOU is no guarantee of getting anything, and you don't need one to do business with China. I think that's the lesson. So I would just ask, what you're getting by signing it. At this point, I think in some cases it's providing legitimacy to, Chinese narratives that a country might not want to provide. So in Australia's case, this is an interesting example because there have been MOUs that have been signed, subnational MOUs. So British Columbia is one example, right, in Canada. Victoria state in Australia is another example, and they're now thinking about getting rid of this thing because they signed this MOU with all this aspirational language about cooperation, and Australia is being hit with economic measures because of frankly because it was asking for an international inquiry into the source of the pandemic. And so, this is how China is treating someone who signed an MOU. Or it's not a great advertisement. So if it doesn't provide you insurance in those cases, it doesn't provide you upfront, big commercial incentives. I'm not sure why you would sign.
Okay, but you can see how this would have been appealing earlier in the. It was announced in 2013, right?
I can see. Yeah, I can see when it was announced then that there might have been, I think, a more reasonable belief at that point that participation would win you these benefits. I don't think anyone signs up without thinking that they're going to get something out of it. And there's a relatively, for some of these places, relatively low cost, right? It's a document that in many cases on the bottom, it literally says this is not a legally binding document. So it's not like you're being asked to really fork over very much in return.
All right. Beyond signaling, maybe signaling to other parties, maybe this is part of, well, Serbia sounds like an interesting case, but potentially signaling to Europe, that you have other options is not a bad strategy in general. Which actually leads to sort of, thinking about the U.S. under the Biden administration, which we assume will will be in power on the 20th of January. But before I get to that, well, let me actually ask two last questions, and you can answer the two or anything else that you haven't sort of had a chance to cover. The first is a little bit more specific on the environmental footprint of the BRI, because Joseph McQuaid at U of T says, do you have any thoughts on the relationship, if any, we can expect to see between Xi's statement on China achieving carbon neutrality by 2060 versus the environmental impacts and environmental footprint of the BRI? How genuine is the Chinese government's new commitment to combating climate change? And is it compatible with the long-term impacts of the BRI? So that's the question on the environment, which we haven't really touched upon. And there may be a distinction between what China pledges to do domestically versus what it does outside of its own borders. And then the other question is really what I wanted to hear your thoughts on, which is, we've seen a peculiar relationship, I think, under the Trump administration. I mean, I guess there are two ways to ask this question. How much of the ways in which the BRI has developed over these past years is in fact a function of what's been happening in the U.S.-China relationship, the retreat of the United States, the trade wars, the U.S. essentially ceding its role, I think, in some ways, in many theaters around the globe. Or moving forward, what can we kind of expect? The $1 million question, but what can we kind of expect with the Biden administration?
Great. So on the environmental question, which is really a terrific question, I think it's worth being somewhat skeptical of the environmental activities, outside of China. And I say that because, at the Second Belt and Road Forum, there were something like 11 environmental related initiatives that were announced. And I think that was done because Chinese officials were acknowledging that this had become a common point of criticism of the Belt and Road. But none of those initiatives, at least that I'm aware, were binding. Most of them are not very transparent. It's hard to know, exactly what's happened with them. And they're not, required of the countries that are participating in the Belt and Road. And so there's been, I think, some effort to, greenwash this. Chinese officials would argue that it's really not their choice. It's, the recipient countries, and, they're happy to do projects to whatever, level the recipient countries want. But in some cases, the recipient countries have asked for, the cheapest possible option. But I think, if China really does want to take on this climate leadership role, that's not an adequate response. And so I think it's worth bringing some skepticism to those claims, and looking at the sort of, I mentioned that energy was one of the two major sectors in Belt and Road activity. The majority of the projects have not been, solar panels. They've been, more carbon intensive projects. So that's the set of facts, on the ground so far. Until we start to see that change, I would bring a little bit of skepticism to those promises. In terms of China's Belt and Road, defined as in reaction to the U.S. and sort of what to expect going forward, I think that some of the overconfidence, or you might call it hubris in some cases, around the sort of initial rollout of the Belt and Road, I think go back to the 2008 financial crisis, and China feeling in some way like it was able to weather this, and therefore its playbook had been vindicated. And I think a similar level of confidence there that some economists had in the United States after World War II, feeling like their model was superior and that their toolkit was almost universal. And they took that toolkit and they went into foreign countries. China, has done something similar. I do think that the United States, in recent years has not done itself very many favors in terms of competing here. When Belt and Road was announced, the United States had, a major economic effort, a pillar of its economic foreign policy in Asia that it doesn't have anymore. And so rather than just criticizing what the Belt and Road is, I think US officials, when the Belt and Road was announced, were able to just talk about what the United States supported and what it was pursuing. And so I think one of the consequences of not having that economic pillar, of not having your own affirmative vision in recent years, has been this default position of just criticizing what China is doing. I did mention, in last 2 years in particular, there've been a few positive developments. And so I expect a new administration to have an opportunity to build on, the sort of more recent efforts to offer alternatives. I expect that there'll be, a very strong focus, first of all, on improving U.S. competitiveness, beginning with domestic actions. It's striking, even despite all of the overpromises of Belt and Road, China has still rolled out, a larger infrastructure package beyond its borders than the United States has been able to authorize, to do domestically in recent years. And so I think that's an area where, anxiety about China could be channeled to more productive ends, making the US more competitive. I also think this focus on working with partners and allies is going to be something that is, a major theme of a Biden-Harris administration. And, I think some people will say, well, what does that actually, that sounds great, but what does it actually mean in practice? This is an area where I think actually more can be done to work with partners and allies. There are several European countries who I think have been holding off on cooperating with the United States on infrastructure projects because of the environmental policy of the Trump administration. I think that's an area where you might see more convergence and a greater ability to work together and an ability to take advantage of, China's, in some cases, failings on environmental issues beyond its borders, using that as a source of comparative advantage. And then finally, I think it's fair to say there will be, a change in some of the diplomacy around competing with China. When the Secretary of State now goes anywhere, it seems like China is the subject. I think you'll probably see U.S. diplomats talking with the places where they are about those places and about their priorities, rather than just about China. So I think there's room for some improvements both on the substance and the style.
No doubt. And it'll be interesting to see how much of what has been bequeathed to the next administration really, continues to determine the relationships going forward. There may be a bit of a hangover, a long shadow at least, right? But we'll see. I mean, this Biden seems to be indicating a very different approach to this, among other kinds of issues. John, thank you so much. This has been a terrific inaugural discussion about the BRI. You've set the groundwork, as it were, for many years of discussions on this topic and how it's going to play itself out in a variety of contexts. Buy the book, buy two, makes a terrific, holiday gift. It really is a good read, very smartly done. And so congratulations on the book, and look forward to following your work going forward and the projects that you're involved in. John, thanks again for joining us. So thunderous applause, everyone. Well done. And
thank you for having me, and really looking forward to following your work too. I think this is a great initiative, and with greatly needed too. So very excited for that.
Yeah, lots to talk about going forward. So take good care, everyone. Be well, and we'll see you at a future event. Take care. Thanks.